Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson, and it's my pleasure tonight to have with us Mr. Harry Gross, who is Chief of Research at the Neurological Institute of Georgia. And Harry is a young man of many talents, and one of them is his interest in history and the way that our world has come to be. Now, right now, I think the country is going through quite a change, potentially. With President Trump being elected, there's been a lot of, discussion about his merits and problems. And the country is waiting for events to happen. And I think this might be an interesting time to talk about the French Revolution and the Thermorian reaction that took place in 1794. Possibly, Harry will give you the football, but maybe you could talk about the condition in France before the 1789 revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. In order to discuss reaction, we need to understand, I think, the context in which the revolution occurs, and that is a France that has fallen dramatically. By the time you get to the 1780s, France is deeply, deeply in debt. The country is effectively bankrupted by Louis XV. Over the course of the 7 Years' War, and then in his support of the American colonists during the American Revolution.
Which was a big deal, wasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, in other words, and I think he was not so interested in helping the Americanos here, but he wanted to give the English a nip.
Exactly.
His arch enemy. And so he may have been led into misjudgment by not understanding the finances, and certainly he was out of touch with conditions on the countryside. Is
Absolutely.
that a fair statement?
There had been, for about a century or so, a very tense relationship between the Third Estate, as it was called, kind of the majority of the common people, and the other two estates, the nobility and the clergy. The vast majority of the tax burden fell on the common people. Any attempts, to Louis XV's credit, there were a number of attempts to reform the tax code during his reign to make up some of these deficits. But they were all vetoed by the aristocracy and the church.
Who I think paid no taxes, is that right?
The church, yeah. The church paid no taxes but received 10% of all taxes in the country. The aristocracy paid almost no taxes. It was the feudal system still. And the
class system was very powerful. And one of the things that might be said about this is, okay, how are we going to have some kind of change? How are we going to have change? What's the condition of the country like? And feudalism might have had a justification in 1300, but hundreds of years had passed. And so the country was locked in a situation that could not persist. And it was kind of like a tectonic plate moved. And it was, as many things are, provoked by money. Mm-hmm. Is that fair? And
yes.
So it's a terrible situation, everything is bad, and the rulers are out of touch with, to put it mildly, with the needs of the citizens.
Yeah. Marie Antoinette's famous statement, let them eat cake, was actually referring to brioche bread, right? But this spongy, sweet bread that was a luxury item of can't they just subsist on this?
Right. So all these things, and once the cat was out of the bag, all kinds of things happened.
Oh, yes.
And then the French Revolution, we obviously there's too much to talk about, but it had its violent side. All kinds of horrific things took place.
Yes.
And the guillotine appeared.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You want to talk about any of that here?
Yeah. Before we even get to the guillotine, we have major outbreaks of violence between royalist forces and revolutionaries. The Bastille is stormed in July of 1789. It's kind of the classic start of the revolution.
Yeah, it was a symbol more than really a symbolic thing.
It also did hold the city's, Paris's gunpowder reserves, though.
Right.
So there was a practical reason to
So
seize
Bastille
it.
Day is their great national
They then
holiday.
demolished the building for its symbolic purposes. And so they declare this new National Assembly, and they just start overturning all of the institutions of French society. The monarchy is declared a constitutional monarchy. Feudalism is abolished. The Catholic Church is nationalized.
All kinds of things happened. You could say religion was minimized, to put it mildly.
Oh,
and I think
to put it mildly.
Sort of a festival of reason.
Yes, under Robespierre, we get de-Christianization.
Right, and
Yeah.
so and this is a tremendously, in particularly places, conservative religion was important to people. Just to blow the place up is literally what happened.
Is what happened.
So France blew up since
Yes.
slow, cautious
And
change was impossible. Seemed
Absolutely.
To be impossible.
And now there were a number of very important reforms that were very popular. There were a lot of economic reforms that were passed that helped alleviate some of the crisis in the countryside and in Paris. The Declaration of the Rights of Man is passed, and a new attitude of the citizen is imposed.
As opposed to subject.
As opposed to subject.
Which is an important thing, may we say, in America.
Yes.
We're not
Yeah.
subjects of anyone, are we?
No.
We're
And-
our own.
Yeah.
And it goes in a way with the Protestant viewpoint about the way the things happen.
Many of the leading revolutionaries actually were Protestant in their leanings, or at least
Yes,
on the
yes.
Protestant kind of end of it. It also did not help the situation that because Marie Antoinette was the sister of the Emperor of Austria,
Right.
that Austria and their ally Prussia went to war with France almost immediately.
So one of the
as
things
well.
one of the things going on was this extraordinary change in the direction of the state. So everyone was swept away that may have had some experience in doing things. New people appeared, and I think their economic system was issuing paper money. There was enormous
Yes.
inflation,
Yes, Ignaz.
and this war took place with Europe. So Europe was a monarchy, and monarchies everywhere, and pretty much you could say it was the remnant of the feudalism was strongly present, and class system strongly
yes.
present, and the revolution rapidly got itself into hot water, did it not? One more
yes.
extreme thing after
or
the
another.
next.
And finally, culminating with the abolition of the monarchy itself and then the execution of Louis XVI for treason. He was accused of trying to flee the country, to work with his relatives out of the country
Right,
to
right.
restore the monarchy. And this only expanded the war. We get the war of the First Coalition out of this, where Britain, the Dutch, Spain,
everybody,
Portugal
yeah, right.
declares war. It's a war of all against all. France is alone. And they're sitting there, instead of reforming the army, instead of actually paying attention to stabilizing the situation, they create a brand new calendar. They change all the names
Which
of the
is
month.
what we've got.
Yeah.
Everything, and so religion is tossed out, the calendar is tossed out, money is tossed out, and whatever the justice system was certainly, as it went through this,
Yes.
the evidence did not need to be presented.
Yes.
So if you just, the prosecutor gives his point, and then who cares about
Yes.
evidence?
If you were declared an outlaw by the convention, you did not need to be tried.
Right.
At all.
And,
You'd be executed without trial.
I don't know how many, quote, aristocrats were executed.
Yeah.
A number, nothing compared to the crimes of our century, the number of people who were killed. But this violent change this whole 26-year period, I don't know how many millions of people were killed. It was like a fire that swept through Europe. And then you could make the case, maybe new plants would grow, new trees would happen after this fire, maybe.
Yeah.
But it certainly was an horrific event. And Robespierre
Yes.
overplayed his hand.
He did overplay his hand, but now he
would just kill his enemies.
his enemies and even some of his allies, if they got to, he came to power as part of a triumvirate with Hébert and Danton, and Danton represented the moderates, Hébert represented the extreme left, who wanted to make the state atheist and abolish religion altogether. Robespierre just wanted to do the cult of the supreme being and kind of secularize religion. He had both of them assassinated, or both of them executed, rather. And he gets this authority because there is this deep sense that the Republic is under threat, and that when the Republic is under threat, existentially, everything is on the table, right? He goes to, he has this great quote that I've included here. The basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. Virtue without terror is baneful. Terror without which virtue is powerless. Right?
And so there's some, I think some points to make here. Number one is this extraordinary event would not have taken place had there been checks and balances in the provinces.
Yes.
But the whole story of the expansion of the French nation, where the provincial authority power had been crushed by the state. So everything is focused on Paris, as in some ways it still is. And also, at least, the allegiance that the peasants, if you want to say that, may have had to the old order was transferred to, well, we just take orders from Paris. And so all of these extreme things came down. And you could make the case in America if you have some kind of extreme things happening in Washington, I would hope, on both sides, whether it's the left or the right, that we will not allow excesses to easily happen. And that's sort of what occurred. And then one thing also I might say is one of the extraordinary things was this levy en masse that took place. So the France is, nothing like it had ever happened.
Yep.
We're going to just take, normally war was kind of an aristocratic event, and maybe you could be tossed in there as somehow you might be roped into it as a peasant. But most people just tried to stay out of it. It was it's for the king to play around with this.
Yeah, you needed your commoners to grow crops so that your economy didn't collapse. You didn't want to be conscripting them willy-nilly.
When this happened, besides the money issue, they mobilized the complete manpower of France to fight everyone. And France, I think, was its population was maybe 20 million, and it was the most populous nation in Europe. And so they had tremendous manpower, which kind of like the Russians. They could just sacrifice their troops. We have so many troops here, just like the Russians have so many people, at least they did. We'll just send people through. Well, they had this tremendous stuff going on. Well, how did the change happen with the Thermopylae?
Yeah, so largely because of all these excesses, he manages to get the country back under control. About half the country's in rebellion. He's losing left and right. And so he executes 40,000 people. Or so.
Mostly aristocrats.
Mostly aristocrats.
Whoever maybe a few priests tossed in.
Yeah, clergy, anyone who was deemed an enemy of the people. And his military reforms, though, actually began to win the day. And so the people, as the existential threat to the Republic begins to ebb away, as the country becomes brought under control again, as the first coalition is defeated, everyone says, okay, now we can actually deal with Robespierre.
Yes.
And his allies start to turn on him. And it does not help that he's cultivated this attitude of paranoia, because anyone could be executed for any reason at any time. And he goes on the 8th of Thermidor, so 26th July, this rambling speech in front of the convention where he threatens imminent purges. And he says, I'm going to start hauling dozens of you out to the guillotine. And he doesn't name any names. And so everyone panics.
Yes.
And it becomes this kind of final moment of everyone who hates him, left, right, center. All of his enemies coalesce and they start planning. So he shows up to the convention the next day, ostensibly to either make more threats or go about his business. He's not even allowed to get a word out before he's confronted with an arrest warrant for crimes against the Republic. He is rescued by soldiers loyal to him from the Paris Commune. They hole up in the Hotel de Ville and a siege ensues over the course of the day. But when the convention and this coup d'etat declares him an outlaw, and all involved with him an outlaw, most of his soldiers defect. They just desert him, run away. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of Thermidor, the forces of the convention under Paul Barras show up to find that he has been shot in the face. Whether that was by someone else or whether he tried to commit suicide. That's one of the things that he might have tried to commit suicide. But he failed, and he spends the night in agony, unable to defend himself or say any words, as he is hauled up to the guillotine the next day, executed with 21 of his closest supporters, including his brother. And then 70 members of the Paris Commune are also executed. It's the largest mass execution in Parisian history.
So it's interesting to look at this. It looks like when you get into these circumstances, reason doesn't work. And one reason to say that, one factor in this is that language has been subverted. So it was a very interesting little epistle you read. I mean, just where the way he thought about things. I'm going to kill you because that's moral. I'm going to pull your eyeballs out because that's the right thing to do because I understand a higher reality.
Yeah.
And this higher reality is actually in your benefit, whoever you are.
Yes.
I'm going to pull the eyeballs out. And if you're against that, I'll have to pull your eyeballs out because I'm the arbitrator of right and wrong. And words don't, I manipulate them so easily. That,
and perspectives. When the good of the state is the supreme good, which is what he declares.
Right.
And he gets to be the decider of what is the good of the state.
and the power of the state is without question there. So you cannot resist the will of the state. It's some kind of a higher place you get into. And the other thing I might ask about, or at least comment on, is opposing opinions. How easily did that happen? I mean, could you, what we'd like to think in the U.S. is we'd like to imagine that we have freedom of speech and that people can stand up. We're going to have a little, we don't like all these guillotines. We're going to march against it or do this or that. Could that be put out there for the public?
Not really. Not under Robespierre and not under Barras either.
Well, that's the point, isn't it? So, and indeed, through this whole French story, in some ways, our competitors and friends, we're frenemies, whatever, with the French, their view of righteousness is not quite the same as ours, but we both pursue righteousness. And another, I think, in the middle of all this, it always interests me that Thomas Jefferson was there, maybe contributing to the Rights of Man document, possibly, but we've got our thumbprint. America's thumbprint is in the middle of this, and it had an impact on our first few decades as a country.
Yes, and we then impacted their institutions. So as the Thermidorian regime kind of comes to power, after Robespierre is overthrown, they create a whole new form of government. They get rid of the convention that had been this unicameral house and the Committee of Public Safety that had been Robespierre's organization. And they create a new constitution with a bicameral legislature modeled on the American legislature in part. You had the Council of 500 that was kind of more elected from the Commons, then the Council of the Ancients, and then you had I think it was the Committee of 5 or whatever it was that was then elected from the Ancients. So you had this kind of procedural up, and it was purposely designed to slow the pace.
Some checks and balances put there.
To establish checks and balances, to prevent wild swings of policy, to stabilize the situation. It introduced an electoral college for all of these incidents. So there were restrictions on suffrages that were imposed. There are a number of rollbacks of kind of the revolutionary change in society.
Well, did the names come back? Is July returned? Did they
Not
return?
until Napoleon takes power.
Now,
in 1805, he will end.
Well, they had the directory after this.
Yes.
So that was the directory was a lot what you were speaking about.
Yes.
And one of the things that happened that was positive, so the forest fire goes through there, many people would be in their positions just because they inherited the positions and they had a certain lassitude about them. They were an aristocrat. We're going to put you in charge of this army division, so to speak, although you're really a drinking problem and you're 19 years old and you're very inept. And so the revolution swept that away, and all the aristocratic officers were pretty much out of the pasture.
Most of them either defected or were executed, but it was Robespierre's actually, I would say some of his greatest contributions were the reforms of the military, because it was what let men from the citizenry who were talented, who would never have been granted a position as an officer under the Ancien regime, get in, and including Napoleon Bonaparte, who actually is friends with Robespierre's brother, Augustine.
Right, and so he was a Corsican, he was an outrider, he never would have gone anywhere. People wouldn't even consider him truly French, mostly think of him as an Italian or something.
Exactly.
And we have a picture of Napoleon as you look at
that. On the other side.
There he is. He's rather interesting pose there, he's the emperor. So this crazy journey that the French undertook, and maybe we could say they were woke when the revolution. I mean, I don't want to get too personal.
You do have Marat say awaken, right? And with the Marseillaise, Arise l'enfant de la patrie, right? Arise, awaken, children.
Formez les bayetons, right? All that stuff.
There is you can make the joke of being woke, I suppose, but there is this counter-revolution, right, that comes with this. And the white terror that follows Robespierre's terror it's less destructive. It doesn't last
Right.
as long. It's not, 40,000 people, but it is about 10,000.
So one of the
People who
issues
were
about,
murdered.
which is a comment to make, is in the U.S., we'd like to think things like this would not happen, but certainly if the cat's out of the bag, humans being what they are, they just kill their enemies, and they do it with some justification. You're a bad person. You could say a bad person because you support Trump, or contrary-wise, but you're in the Democratic Party, you're bad. And what should we do with you? Well, if you threaten us enough, we'll kill you, so to speak, and we'll do it with a legal dispatch, possibly, which is something to be aware of: violence, hatred, and that's a card in the deck. And I'll maybe make the comment now about our present political situation here, speaking about the French thing, all this extraordinary violence, things are turned upside down. The normal ways that change take place just haven't existed for centuries of this pressure building up. Every year the tectonic plates are more. And I think we could contrast that to the British situation. Maybe they learned something from watching the French, maybe, but they certainly they're gradually the way their society works. They haven't killed too many people.
Well, I wouldn't say that. There's been a long history of political violence in England.
Well, I'd say since the French Revolution, and so you could really say the way that power.
Most of their violence was done before the French Revolution.
Right. Well, they certainly had a lot of stuff, but one of the issues is the way the big dogs surrendered power. It was in the UK. It was certainly a lot more peaceful, a lot more restrained, and one could say more civilized. And maybe they had some experience with the French arrangement. And I don't know what the lessons for us would be presently. Yeah. We've got, I'd say this, maybe we had a slight discussion about it. We have a really substantial change in the political power in the country with Trump and his allies coming in, and so is that going to be the end of the world or not? And I've submitted, I don't think it is. And if you have to say, well, I really can't stand this situation, well, wait 2 years, wait 4 years. And the same with maybe the conservatives. I just can't stand the Democratic running the country. I can't stand it. Wait a little bit, and particularly if things get a little too extreme, the situation will come back. And contrary-wise, exactly the same thing if Trump is going to be too extreme. You could imagine the system will right itself, and in going back and forth like this, I think it really is. That's a good system, going back and forth, and we don't have to kill anybody, guillotine anybody, and you could expect, I think, some kind of change to the right, to be something. But that's not the end of the world. The system will right itself again. As Winston Churchill said, be patient, all will come right in the end, as he's talking about World War II. Well, that's an interesting story. We haven't changed anything like the way the French left did things. Mm-hmm. Nothing like that. You could say the woke world has done some things. We mentioned maybe they took some statues down. They changed some names of some military bases, and they put their constituency, they put their names on whatever you want to put it on. So that's not it's not a heinous act, it's not such an extreme act, yeah. And I would think that Trump may do something along those lines somewhere. It would be offensive to people in some ways.
Well,
and that's what you could expect, but that's not the end of the world. And as long as the system allows for change.
Yeah, the difference though, and this is where I think that the damage can come, is in institutional changes. It's one thing to rename some bases, take down some statues. No institutions were fundamentally altered over the last few years.
Well, I don't know. But
But when we're talking about privatizing the Postal Service, abolishing government departments, overhauling, placing people who want the demise of their own departments in charge of departments, the death of the administrative capacity of the state is fundamentally irreplaceable and fundamentally damaging.
that's a hard word to say, irreplaceable. But I think change, things get back, they go the other way. And you can make the case, and I think this is a legitimate thing to say, is my view is I want the government to be 60% of the GNP. I want I want a socialist country. I want a socialist country and this with a very powerful state that attempts to pass out benefits to its constituents. I mean, we're going to give you this benefit. We're going to do this. We're going to give you a nice job at the post office. And it's not going to matter too much. The efficiency issue won't matter. The money that you lose or don't lose, whatever. That will not be of such relevance. So if you're competing with other countries, other viewpoints, the national power could be diminished in some circumstances with tolerating inefficiencies in the government. So if you say, I want to put some new efficiencies in, or I want to examine that, or I want some checks and balances on all of the government power, then that doesn't sound too unreasonable to me. And
No,
I don't
but
think if you abolish the post office, maybe the next person coming back in, I'm not sure who that will be, some appropriate Democratic person, well, I'll put the post office back, or
Except
I'll do
that takes so much. It's harder to put the wheels back on the bus than it is to take them off. And the one thing that even through all the Thermidor that never did,
that's a pretty big statement.
It is. No, so if everyone walked into the hospital and fired all of the doctors,
yes,
or even 60% of the doctors, right, and just said, you're out, you're done,
yes,
what would happen to the hospital?
well, it would. The argument would be if you're more measured in whatever you do, say, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, things could work out. But it's not wrong and I think most people would agree with this. We want a more efficient.
That's not what I asked. I
No,
asked
well,
what would
I know-
happen
I
if
know-
60% of the doctors in the hospital were
but
fired,
is that-
which is
is-
what Elon Musk and Victor
Well, I know that,
Abdullahi
but it
and
hasn't happened, has it?
No, it has. But this is what they're talking about
I know
doing.
that, but so that's the common thing that happens in these arrangements. I think they toss ideas out, they do this, and it may be some of Trump's negotiatory strategy. At least that's
Maybe
it is
so.
or not. Well,
But
and
you
all
have
these
two
checks
choices.
and balances. But I
Take
don't
them at
think
their word,
I don't think anything
or not.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that. You could say, well, I'm going to pay attention to it, but I know it could be a negotiatory thing. It'd be some of both. It could be I'm going to pay attention to this, but this could be a negotiatory tactic.
It could
and
be.
The question is there some, and I think people would say this, there's reason to consider the power of the state, what they do or don't do. Can we make things better? And then the other statement is out there, which I think is a big one, is the government's currency arrangements, the way the country depends on borrowed money and indeed printing money, the way that and it's quite an arrangement by which the government is able to finance its enormous budgetary shortfalls. There are all kinds of things underway. They're printing money, and so you could expect, with nothing else going on, that ultimately, there are many factors in this, and ultimately the way the monarchy had a problem in France with the money issues many, many times. What happens that provokes violent change is at some point it just can't continue. And is there an argument to, in some ways, make things more efficient and to say, I'm not going to do it just because whatever, I'm just not going to do it. But if said, well, I'm going to let's say, the post office can exist in a muted fashion, possibly, and we'll see what happens with.
Well, there's a few points I want to respond to this. One, it's very ironic that you mentioned printing inflation light, because the Thermidors actually, one of their downfalls was they got rid of the price controls imposed by Robespierre, and inflation skyrocketed.
Do you think? No, you could make the argument. I mean, we could joust on that point.
Well, but
price controls themselves were not very, they're not very
Oh,
effective.
no, they
were
caused
clumsy.
mass shortages. I'm not saying they were
clumsy.
good. I'm just saying it's ironic.
Generally-
But what I want to get to, though, is I said earlier
I
that,
think
that I
that- yes, go
view
ahead.
Trump as a thermidorian reaction, the modern conservative
good.
in
I think
America,
that's
as a
appropriate.
thermidorian
That's
reaction
good. That's
to
the
the New Deal. And everything you've named is a New Deal, is a result of the New Deal.
Right.
All of these powers, all of this stuff was part of the New Deal and the expansion of the federal government, the removal of the gold standard, all of these things. Second, when I talk about the post office, you speak of the post office as a business. It is not a business. It is a service. And that is what government is supposed to be. Government is not meant to be a business. Markets, when you look at markets, their strength is they will find an efficient point of equilibrium. The problem with markets is that markets don't care what the inputs are. There is a perfect efficient equilibrium between puppies and cancer. You have to determine what you want the goal to be. The point of the Postal Service is not to be efficient. It is to provide a public service
Well,
that cannot be replicated because it's not profitable to deliver to every single address in this country. That's why FedEx and UPS don't do it.
the takeaway message is with the price and what people pay or whatever. And I think one of the things the post office does is it sends thousands of pieces of junk mail out there. So that may or may not be a service. It may or may not be appropriate for the post office to do that.
That has to be paid for by the person sending it.
No, I think there's an arrangement that's there, and it may be beneficial to the people that do it. So in other words, exploring all of those issues I think would be appropriate. And then people could say, what do I really, if I want this service, how do I want to do it? What do I want to do? How does it work? What am I willing to pay for it? And I think that's an appropriate discussion to have. And many people would say the post office has other factors than merely a service. It's an employment arrangement that's put together for hundreds of thousands of people, and I think that's a fair statement. Well, I think it's time to conclude. Let me summarize by saying, Harry, you had some very important thoughts, and I'll have to brood about them, as maybe our large audience will as well. So thanks for your
so.
comments.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you
Thanks
for
a lot.
having
We
me.
appreciate having you. Right.